For an island nation at the bottom of the world, maritime security is a baseline requirement for economic survival. Yet, New Zealand's primary instruments for securing its vast maritime interest, the Royal New Zealand Navy, is facing an unprecedented structural crisis, stemming from a shortage of trained personnel and aging equipment that requires replacing in the not-too-distant future. The current fleet is modest by any international standard, consisting of just 8 commissioned vessels. The core combat capability rests on the 2 Anzac-class frigates, Te Kaha and Te Mana. Border security and regional monitoring are handled by 2 Protector-class offshore patrol vessels and 2 Lake-class inshore patrol vessels. The remainder of the fleet consists of 2 essential logistics vessels, the polar-capable replenishment oiler HMNZS Aotearoa and the multi-role amphibious support vessel HMNZS Canterbury. The small force is tasked with patrolling an exclusive economic zone of more than 4 million square kilometers, while simultaneously meeting broader international obligations. The traditional argument for New Zealand maintaining its own sovereign navy is anchored in geography and international law. As a country heavily reliant on sea lines of communication, roughly 99% of New Zealand's trade in goods by volume moves by ship. Any disruption to these international shipping lanes immediately threatens national prosperity and supply chain stability. Beyond trade, New Zealand holds constitutional defense responsibilities for the Cook Islands, Niue, and Tokelau. It also acts as a primary coordinator for humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and maritime search and rescue operations across a massive swath of the South Pacific. By operating its own naval fleet, Wellington demonstrates a tangible commitment to global partnerships and regional stability, proving that it is a contributor to regional security rather than a passive observer. However, the severe operational pressures facing the defense force has sparked a radical thought exercise among some analysts. What if New Zealand simply stopped trying to maintain an independent naval capability? What if the country decommissioned its fleet, shut down Devonport's naval base, and outsourced its entire maritime defense requirements to traditional allies, Australia, and the United States? While such a policy shift seems unthinkable within current policy circles, it is worth examining through a cold analytical lens. Evaluating the pros and cons of this hypothetical choice reveals the profound trade-offs inherent in New Zealand's defense planning. The most immediate argument in favor of outsourcing maritime security is the opportunity to tap into the overwhelming high-end capabilities of New Zealand's closest security partners. By aligning completely with the United States Navy, New Zealand would effectively place its maritime security in the hands of the world's premier naval power. The US Navy can deploy unmatched maritime firepower, underwritten by its enormous fleet of Arleigh Burke destroyers, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, and the Virginia-class attack submarines. Similarly, the Royal Australian Navy provides substantial regional presence with its smaller but balanced mix of Hobart-class air warfare destroyers, frigates, amphibious warfare vessels, and the Collins-class conventional submarines. No amount of investments by Wellington could ever replicate even a fraction of this allied naval power. Under an outsourced model, New Zealand's waters would be protected by some of the world's most capable naval vessels, naval air power, submarine forces, and surveillance capability, creating a strong deterrent against any hostile actor. The second major advantage is financial. Maintaining a modern navy is an exceptionally expensive endeavour for a small island economy. The New Zealand defence budget sits at roughly 6 billion New Zealand dollars, and the capital-intensive Royal New Zealand Navy consume about 25% of these funds. The mere upkeep of the ships, the maintenance and operations is already costly. Allocations from the recent budget 2026 directed $143 million of capital expenditure for life extension work and $72 million of operating expenditure over 4 years for the 2 Anzac frigates and the logistics transport, the Canterbury. The upcoming maritime fleet renewal program will require billions of dollars over the next decade to replace naval vessels reaching the end of their operational lifespans by the mid-2030s. Disbanding the Navy would instantly eliminate these massive and ongoing capital expenditures. The resulting financial windfall could be redirected towards domestic priorities like healthcare, education, and infrastructure, or used to bolster the New Zealand Army and the Royal New Zealand Air Force. Furthermore, outsourcing the Navy would decisively resolve the persistent workforce crisis that has affected naval readiness for years. The Royal New Zealand Navy has suffered from acute personnel shortages, driven by competition from the civilian sector and concerns around remuneration. At various points, these crewing shortfalls have forced the Navy to idle up to 1/3 of its fleet. Ships like the offshore patrol vessel, the Otago, have spent extended periods laid up at the wharf simply because there were not enough qualified sailors and technicians to take them to sea. If New Zealand no longer operates a navy, the complex problem of recruiting, training, and retaining specialized maritime personnel disappears entirely. No navy, no more problems. The Defence Force would no longer need to worry about engineering vacancies or competitive salary for specialized trades, at least in the Navy. As you can see, there are reasons why reasonable people may support disbanding the Navy. However, despite these clear practical advantages, the strategic arguments against outsourcing naval requirements are severe and extensive. Let's go through why we might not want to give up the Royal New Zealand Navy in a hurry. The first major obstacle is that this arrangement might be entirely unacceptable to Australia and the United States. The US Congress have grown increasingly vocal in their criticism of Allied free riding, repeatedly demanding that alliance partners increase their defense spending to at least 2% of gross domestic product. Washington is highly unlikely to accept a proposal where New Zealand completely abdicates its maritime responsibilities while expecting American taxpayers to fill the void. Australia, already burdened by its massive financial commitments to the AUKUS security partnership, would similarly balk at patrolling New Zealand's vast exclusive economic zone without major concessions. To secure such an agreement, Wellington would likely have to offer significant, unpalatable trade-offs, such as hosting foreign military bases or placing its land forces under foreign command. This leads directly to the second consequence, which is the total erosion of New Zealand's national sovereignty and its highly valued independent foreign policy. For decades, Wellington has navigated global affairs by making deliberate independent foreign policy choices aligned with its core values and economic interest, rather than blindly following the great powers. For example, New Zealand has played an effective balancing act in managing its important relationships with the US and China. If New Zealand relies entirely on external allies for its physical survival at sea, its strategic priorities will inevitably become subservient to the national interest of Canberra and Washington. To guarantee Allied protection, New Zealand would have to sign binding, rigid defense treaties. These agreements may strip Wellington of its diplomatic flexibility, forcing it to align its foreign policy directly with its protectors to ensure that the security umbrella remains intact. The flow-on effect of this is the increased risk of entanglement into unwanted foreign wars. If the US Navy and the Royal Australian Navy are responsible for securing the waters around Auckland and Wellington, they will expect reciprocity. New Zealand could find it nearly impossible to refuse requests for military assistance when its allies deploy into distant conflict. The nation could easily find itself dragged into high-intensity naval confrontations in the Western Pacific or the Middle East. Instead of avoiding conflicts by maintaining an objective defensive posture, New Zealand would become just one component of foreign military machines, potentially participating in wars that do not align with its national interest or public support. Outsourcing would also create profound domestic political friction regarding New Zealand's nuclear-free status. This policy has been a defining pillar of the national identity for more than 4 decades, enshrined in legislation since 1987. Under an outsourced defense framework, the United States and Australia would almost certainly demand regular maritime access to New Zealand ports for replenishment and maintenance. The US obviously has nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines that would directly contravene New Zealand's nuclear-free position if it were to enter New Zealand ports. As Australia transitions to operating nuclear-powered attack submarines under the AUKUS framework, New Zealand would face immense Allied pressure to allow these vessels into its harbours. Refusing entry to the very nuclear-powered submarines tasked with protecting New Zealand's trade routes would create an absurd contradiction, likely forcing Wellington to abandon its long-standing anti-nuclear position. Another major operational drawback is that foreign navies do not specialize in the specific capabilities New Zealand actually requires on a day-to-day basis. Superpower navies are built for high-end blue water combat and power projection. Their fleets are dominated by heavily armed warships designed for launching cruise missiles or hunting submarines. In contrast, New Zealand's primary maritime challenges are low-intensity security tasks. The country needs persistent, cost-effective assets to conduct patrols, deter transnational crime, enforce border protection, and deliver humanitarian aid to Pacific Island communities. By relying on allies, New Zealand would lose the practical utility and the optimization of an adaptable fleet focused on lower-intensity operations. Finally, abandoning the fleet means the permanent loss of institutional knowledge and technical expertise. Operating a navy is a highly specialized discipline that takes generations to mature. It requires a deep understanding of marine engineering, damage control, maritime law, and complex combat systems. If New Zealand disbands its naval force, that accumulated expertise evaporates. If geopolitical circumstances change in the future, and Wellington decides it must rebuild its own navy, it will be forced to start from scratch. Rebuilding a naval force is infinitely more difficult, expensive, and time-consuming than expanding an army, for example. When we weigh these arguments, the conclusion becomes clear. The idea of outsourcing New Zealand's navy to Australia and the United States is a dangerous illusion. To put it simply, it's a terrible idea. While the financial savings and the resolution of the personnel shortage appear attractive on paper, the true cost would be paid in national sovereignty. Total reliance on foreign powers would reduce New Zealand to security dependency, strip the nation of its independent voice, potentially force it into foreign conflict, and undermine its nuclear-free position. The realistic path forward is not abdication, but rejuvenation. New Zealand must accept the security realities of being an island nation, fully fund the Maritime Fleet Renewal Program, and resolve its retention issues to ensure it maintains a credible naval capability in a volatile world.